Don't let him leave with that SUV. The voice cracked across the quiet street so sharply that even the sprinklers seemed to hesitate, and Marcus Ellison stopped with one hand still resting on the driver's door, the black paint of the vehicle catching the pale gold of early morning like polished glass. He had been in the neighborhood less than 12 hours. Half the boxes in the house behind him were still unopened. The curtains were not up yet. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter somewhere inside, untouched and cooling, while outside a man Marcus had never met was already pointing at him like he belonged in handcuffs instead of a two-story home at the end of a clean suburban cul-de-sac. Ethan Whitmore stood barefoot on his trimmed lawn, one arm stretched out, his face tight with the kind of certainty that never needed facts, only an audience. "I knew something was off," he said, louder now, making sure the words carried to the other driveways, the open garages, the Ring cameras mounted beside glossy front doors. "That's not your car." A curtain shifted across the street. Then another. A garage door paused halfway open. The neighborhood was waking up, and Marcus could feel it happening in layers, like lights slowly filling a room he had not agreed to enter. He looked down at the key fob in his palm, then back at Ethan, his expression calm enough to be mistaken for surrender if someone did not know the difference between silence and weakness. The air smelled like cut grass, expensive mulch, and fresh pavement warming under the sun. Somewhere farther down the block, a dog barked once and then went quiet. Claire Whitmore appeared beside her husband still in silk sleepwear and house slippers, already holding up her phone, already recording. Her mouth made a thin line as her eyes flicked from Marcus to the SUV and back again, performing the same cold calculation her husband had made in an instant. The vehicle was too new, too expensive, too wrong in front of the wrong house with the wrong man beside it. Marcus had seen that math before. Not on paper. On faces. In elevators. In lobbies. In parking lots. In every pause that lasted a second too long after he offered his name. "We're calling the police," Claire said, and she said it with the smug steadiness of someone who believed the ending had already been written for her. Marcus slowly pressed the lock button once, and the SUV chirped in response, bright and clean, a small sound that should have settled the whole thing. It did not. If anything, it made Ethan step closer. "Keys don't prove anything," he snapped. "People steal keys too." More doors opened now. More eyes appeared. A man in running shoes stood on his porch pretending to stretch while he listened. A woman in a tennis skirt paused at the mailbox, not close enough to intervene, only close enough to witness. Marcus felt the weight of every gaze land on him, not curious, not neutral, but already shaped by a story they found easier to believe than the truth standing right in front of them. He kept his shoulders loose, kept his breathing even, kept his voice low when he finally spoke. "Sir," he said, "you should be careful accusing a stranger of a crime when you don't know who he is." Ethan laughed at that, short and sharp, a laugh with no humor in it. "Oh, I know enough," he said. And that was the ugliest part. Not that he knew Marcus, that he believed he did. Marcus did not move, and that unsettled them more than anger would have. People knew what to do with anger. They could point at it, call it threatening, use it to justify everything that came next. But calm was harder. Calm made a person look at themselves for a second, and nobody on that street looked eager to do that. The morning light kept spreading over the roofs and driveways, turning the windows into sheets of pale fire, and Marcus stood in the middle of it all wearing a charcoal pullover, dark jeans, and the expression of a man who had spent years learning that dignity sometimes meant holding still while strangers tried to assign you a role in their fear. He had arrived in Fairmont Ridge late the night before after a 3-hour drive from the city, his trunk packed with garment bags, files, a framed photograph, and the few boxes he had not trusted the movers to handle. He had slept less than 4 hours on an air mattress in a house that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard. By sunrise, he had already stacked dishes in the kitchen, set 2 books on the living room shelf, and carried a small potted plant to the front window because the place felt less empty with something alive in it. He had noticed how quiet the neighborhood was, the kind of curated quiet money buys with association rules, trimmed hedges, and the shared confidence that everyone in view belongs. Or at least belongs according to the invisible standards nobody writes down because they expect everyone to recognize them on sight. Marcus had recognized them immediately. He always did. Still, He had come outside with his coffee and his keys thinking only about the day ahead, about the schedule waiting for him downtown, about the formal introductions, the briefings, the press he would eventually have to face. He had not expected to be put on trial before breakfast by a man in monogrammed slippers and a woman filming from 12 feet away. Claire lowered her phone just enough to study Marcus more carefully, as if a closer look might produce the proof she wanted. "You just moved in?" she asked, but it was not really a question. It was the first layer of an argument she had already built in her head. Marcus gave a small nod. "Last night." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Convenient," he said. "Nobody has seen you before, and suddenly there is a luxury SUV in the driveway." Marcus glanced at the house key hanging beside the electronic fob, then at the address numbers fixed in brushed bronze beside the front door. The absurdity of it would have been almost funny in a different country, in a different history, in a different life. But here it landed with the heavy, familiar weight of something old dressed up as neighborhood concern. Across the street, the woman in the tennis skirt stopped pretending to check her mail and simply stared. The runner on the porch folded his arms. Someone farther down the block opened a second-story window. Marcus could feel the story spreading without him, sentence by sentence, face to face, each person adding a little certainty to something none of them had actually witnessed. He thought, not for the first time, about how fast suspicion moves when it is carried by comfort. Ethan took another step forward, planting himself near the edge of Marcus's driveway like he had the right to patrol not just the street but the meaning of every person on it. "What is your name?" he demanded. Marcus looked at him for a long second, not because he was afraid, because he was measuring the moment, deciding whether his name would land as a fact or a challenge in the ears already listening. When he finally answered, his voice was steady and low. "Marcus Ellison." Ethan repeated it as though testing it for weakness. Claire lifted the phone again. Then Ethan said, "Well, Marcus Ellison, around here people work hard for what they have." The sentence hung in the air, polished and poisonous. Marcus felt it for what it was, not just an accusation about a vehicle, but a verdict about his existence, his house, his clothes, his presence in a zip code men like Ethan treated as inherited territory. He looked past him at the neat line of homes, the American flags, the stone planters, the spotless driveways, and he understood the real trespass in their eyes had never been about the SUV at all. Ethan spoke like a man who had spent years confusing ownership with virtue. There was something polished about him, something carefully assembled, from the pressed collar of his pale golf shirt to the expensive watch sitting loose on his wrist, as if even time moved differently for people like him. He was not loud because he had lost control. He was loud because control had worked for him his entire life. Marcus could see it in the way Ethan stood half in the driveway and half in the street, claiming both without asking. In the way the neighbors kept looking to him for the next sentence, as if he had been elected mayor of their fear. Claire stayed close beside him, phone lifted, chin tilted. Every inch the woman who believed documentation became truth the moment it matched her assumptions. The lens remained fixed on Marcus, never on Ethan, never on the crowd forming around a lie, because people like Claire rarely imagined that the person holding the camera might also be holding the wrong story. "That is exactly what they all say," Ethan replied when Marcus warned him to be careful. The sentence landed with practiced ease, too smooth to be spontaneous, as if he had said versions of it before in boardrooms, homeowners association meetings, private clubs, and dinner conversations where prejudice wore a tie and called itself common sense. Marcus said nothing. Silence was beginning to do its work now, not softening the moment, but sharpening it. Every extra word from Ethan made the air thinner. Every second Marcus refused to perform outrage forced the ugliness into clearer view. He could see it dawning on a few faces already, not as guilt, not yet, but as discomfort. The woman with the mail stopped shifting her weight and lowered her gaze for a second. The runner on the porch uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again. Nobody stepped in. Nobody told Ethan to slow down. But the certainty around him had started to wobble at the edges. Ethan either did not notice or did not care. Men like him often mistook attention for agreement. "Fairmont Ridge has standards," he said, glancing around as if delivering remarks at a committee luncheon instead of accusing a stranger in public. "People here know each other. We watch out for suspicious behavior." Marcus almost smiled at the phrase suspicious behavior. It was one of those clean American expressions that had traveled a long distance without ever washing its hands. It could mean anything. It often meant exactly what the speaker needed it to mean. A different car. A different face. A black man standing calmly in front of his own front door, while white neighbors searched for a reason to call that confidence stolen. A soft breeze moved through the maple trees lining the street, stirring the small flags planted near one of the flower beds, and carrying the scent of roasted coffee from somewhere nearby. It should have been an ordinary suburban morning. Instead it felt staged, almost theatrical, as if the neighborhood had been waiting for someone like Marcus to arrive so it could reveal itself to him all at once. He thought about the city he had just left, about offices with fluorescent lights and briefing binders and conference tables where people measured every word because titles were printed on doors and power was visible. Out here, power wore loafers and stood on decorative stone. It hid inside property values and neighborhood watch chats and the confidence to call the police before asking a single honest question. Claire lowered her phone for a moment and looked at Ethan. Maybe we should just wait for the officers, she said, but there was no mercy in it. Only strategy. She wanted authority to arrive and confirm what they had already decided. Ethan gave a small nod, but his eyes never left Marcus. That is exactly what we are doing, he said. Then he added, quieter but somehow meaner. People get very bold when they think no one will challenge them. Marcus let that sit between them. He looked past Ethan and saw his own reflection faintly in the SUV window, dark and steady, shoulders squared, face unreadable. He thought of the oath he had taken in earlier years, the ones that had shaped him before this town ever learned his name. He thought of how often men like Ethan mistook restraint for powerlessness because they had never developed any real restraint themselves. In the distance, so faint at first it could have been mistaken for wind, came the low rise of sirens. Claire lifted her phone again. Ethan straightened, satisfaction spreading across his face before the first patrol car had even turned the corner. Marcus heard the sound and felt something settle deep inside him. Not fear, not relief, but the quiet certainty that this street was about to learn the difference between authority and entitlement. The sirens grew louder, then bent around the corner in a slow blue flash that washed briefly across garage doors, trimmed hedges, and the polished hood of the SUV, turning the whole street into something colder than it had been a minute before. Ethan Whitmore took one step back and squared his shoulders as though he were preparing to welcome the law he believed already belonged to him. Claire kept her phone raised, steady as ever, capturing the arrival with the confidence of someone who still expected the final scene to go her way. Marcus remained where he was, one hand resting at his side, the other loosely holding the key fob, his face unreadable in the brightening morning. He watched the first patrol unit roll to a stop at the curb and the second ease in behind it, tires whispering over the clean pavement. The doors opened. Two uniformed officers stepped out into the fresh suburban sunlight, and for one strange suspended second nobody on the street moved. Ethan was the first to fill that silence. "Officers, thank God," he called out, already halfway smiling. "This man is trespassing, and we believe the vehicle may be stolen." He delivered the accusation with the smooth urgency of a man who had rehearsed outrage all his life and called it civic duty. One of the officers, a woman with a dark blonde ponytail tucked neatly through the back of her cap, turned first toward Ethan, then toward Marcus, and something in her posture shifted so quickly it was almost too subtle for the neighbors to notice. But Marcus noticed. He noticed the brief stillness in her face, the faint widening of her eyes, the instant recalculation. Her partner, a younger officer with a square jaw and a notebook already in hand, followed her gaze to Marcus and slowed down as well. Ethan did not see any of it. He was too busy talking. "We saw him here with the SUV and he could not explain it," he said. "He just showed up and nobody knows him. We are trying to protect the neighborhood." The female officer took a step forward, but her eyes remained on Marcus. "Sir," she said carefully, and that single word changed the temperature of the street more than the sirens had. Ethan blinked. Claire lowered the phone an inch. The runner on the porch leaned forward. Marcus met the officer's gaze, calm as ever. "Good morning, officer," he said. There was no strain in his voice, no dramatic emphasis, no effort to make the moment larger than it already was. But Ethan heard something in the exchange he did not understand, and confusion flashed across his face before pride rushed in to cover it. Yes, exactly, Ethan said, stepping in again. Ask him for identification. Ask him whose car this really is. The younger officer looked from Ethan to Marcus, then back to his partner, as if waiting for her lead. She gave him the smallest shake of her head before returning her attention to Marcus. Sir, she said again, more formally this time. Is everything all right here? Ethan let out a short laugh of disbelief. Is everything all right? Of course it is not all right. We called because this is suspicious. Marcus could feel every set of eyes on him now, not just watching but trying to solve the scene before it solved itself. He took in the neighborhood all at once, the immaculate driveways, the decorative shutters, the hydrangeas planted in perfect rows, the little audience gathered in workout clothes and robe belts and polished weekend casual. He saw how quickly certainty had brought them outside, and how quickly uncertainty was beginning to pin them in place. It was there now, moving through the crowd like a change in pressure before a storm. Claire swallowed and adjusted her grip on the phone. Ethan's jaw tightened. The female officer stepped closer to Marcus, and when she spoke again her voice carried just enough to reach the nearest porches. Sir, I did not expect to see you before Monday. The sentence landed softly, but its effect was immediate. Ethan's expression loosened, not into understanding, not yet, but into the first real crack in his confidence. Marcus turned his head slightly toward him, then back to the officer. The morning sun glinted off the badge on her chest and the windshield of the SUV behind him. Somewhere down the block a child's bicycle bell rang once, bright and out of place. Marcus finally drew a slow breath and answered with the same measured calm that had held him steady from the beginning. Plans changed, he said. And for the first time since the shouting started, Ethan Whitmore looked like a man standing on ground that might not belong to him after all. The street did not go fully quiet after that, but it changed. The easy confidence drained out of it first, then the murmurs, then the little expressions people wear when they think they understand more than they do. What remained was thinner, stranger, almost brittle. Ethan Whitmore stood with one hand still half raised as if he could physically stop the moment from moving any further. Claire lowered her phone another inch, not enough to admit doubt, only enough to betray it. The younger officer closed his notebook without writing a word. The female officer straightened almost imperceptibly and gave Marcus the kind of respect that did not need to be announced to be felt. We received a call about a suspicious vehicle, she said, her tone now careful in a very different way. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Ethan blinked hard, his face tightening around the effort to regain control. A misunderstanding, he repeated. No, that is not what this is. We were trying to help. Nobody told us who he was. Marcus turned slightly toward him, and the movement alone was enough to silence the rest of the street. He did not step closer. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You did not ask who I was, he said. The words were plain, almost gentle, but they landed with a precision that made Claire look down at the screen in her hand as though it had suddenly become heavier. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. You have to understand how this looked. Marcus let that sit between them. How this looked. As if appearance had arrived from nowhere. As if the scene had built itself without the help of assumptions. Without the old reflex that turned a black man with a nice vehicle into a problem needing witnesses. The morning sun had climbed higher now, laying hard white light across the roofs and the edges of the driveways. It caught in the polished chrome of the SUV, flashed on the officers' badges, and made Ethan's carefully composed face look washed and exposed. Marcus could smell the coffee inside his house through the still open front door, that faint roasted warmth drifting out into a moment gone cold. He thought about how many times in life men like Ethan depended on performance, on volume, on a crowd willing to treat confidence like evidence. He had seen it in hearings, in public complaints, in press conferences, in quiet internal meetings where certain voices entered the room already believing they could define reality for everyone else. The difference was that here, on this neat suburban street with decorative stone mailboxes and fresh mulch in every flower bed, the lie had arrived in house shoes and called itself vigilance. The younger officer finally spoke, his tone restrained. Sir, this vehicle is registered at this address. He was speaking to Ethan now, but he kept glancing at Marcus as if still catching up to the weight of what stood in front of him. The female officer added, "And Mr. Ellison is expected by the department." That was all she said. She did not explain further. She did not need to. The sentence moved through the gathered neighbors like a current under still water. A window across the street slid shut. The runner on the porch stepped backward into his doorway. The woman in the tennis skirt looked down at the envelope in her hand, as though she had suddenly remembered somewhere else to be. Claire's phone dropped fully to her side. Ethan alone remained fixed in place, but even he looked smaller now, not physically smaller, just diminished by the collapse of his own certainty. "Expected by the department," he said slowly, and now there was something new in his voice. Not anger, not righteousness. Fear, perhaps, but not the kind that comes from danger. The kind that comes from realizing the story you told so loudly is about to turn around and stare back at you. Marcus watched him with the same calm he had carried from the first accusation. He could have ended it right there. He could have said everything at once and let the humiliation fall where it belonged. But there was a discipline in him that had been built over years, and it held now. He looked at the officers, then at the small crowd, then at Ethan. "I am not interested in embarrassing anyone," he said. That sentence seemed to hit Claire harder than anything else. Her face changed, just slightly, as if kindness had somehow made the whole thing worse. Because cruelty can be argued with. Cruelty gives people something to resist. Mercy leaves them standing alone with what they already did. Ethan swallowed and glanced around at the neighbors who had quietly abandoned him one look at a time. For the first time since he shouted across the street, he no longer seemed like the man leading the scene. He looked like a man stranded in it. The female officer drew in a measured breath, then said, with formal clarity and just enough volume for every porch and open garage to hear, "Sir, welcome to Fairmont Ridge." And Ethan Whitmore finally understood that the man he had tried to reduce in front of the whole neighborhood had arrived there with a title far bigger than the one Ethan had spent his whole life giving himself. For a few seconds after those words, nobody seemed to know what to do with their own hands. Claire still held her phone, but she was no longer recording anything that could help her. The device hung at her side like an object that had outlived its purpose. Ethan stood on the clean edge of Marcus's driveway with the strange stiffness of a man who had spent his whole life believing position could protect him from shame, only to discover that shame did not care about property lines. The neighborhood around them remained almost painfully beautiful. Sunlight rested on the trimmed hedges. Water from a sprinkler clicked softly somewhere farther down the block. A flag stirred once on a porch across the street, then fell still again. It was the kind of morning that magazines liked to photograph, the kind that promised order, comfort, and good schools. But Marcus had worked long enough in this country to know how often disorder hid inside places that looked immaculate from the outside. He glanced toward the open front door of his house. Inside, the air would still be cool. The coffee he had poured before all this began would be lukewarm by now, a quiet, ordinary thing waiting in a kitchen that did not yet feel fully lived in. That thought touched him more than he expected, not because of the coffee itself, but because of everything it represented. A new address, a new chapter, a chance to build something honest in a city that had asked for his leadership. And before he had even finished unpacking, the first welcome he received had come in the form of accusation, spectacle, and suspicion dressed up as civic concern. The female officer, Dana Ruiz, seemed to understand more than she said. She shifted her weight and gave Marcus a look that carried both professionalism and something gentler beneath it, perhaps regret that this had become his first view of the community he was about to serve. Her partner kept his eyes lowered for a moment, as if he had stumbled into a lesson nobody had prepared him to witness this early in the day. Marcus did not blame either of them. Their arrival had not created the ugliness on this street. It had only illuminated it. That was often the way with authority at its best. Not noise. Not intimidation. Illumination. Ethan cleared his throat, but the sound came out thin. "Mr. Ellison," he began, and even the use of the name felt new on his tongue, stripped now of the confidence with which he had demanded it. Marcus turned his head slightly, enough to acknowledge him without rescuing him from the moment. Ethan looked over one shoulder as if hoping the neighbors might somehow lend him back some part of his earlier certainty, but the porches had grown emptier. Garage doors had lowered. Curtains had stilled. People who had eagerly gathered for suspicion were suddenly very busy elsewhere. That, too, Marcus noticed. Communities loved spectacle until accountability arrived. Then everybody remembered an appointment. Claire finally slipped her phone into the pocket of her robe. The movement was small, but in its own way it was the first honest thing she had done all morning. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair and brushed it across her cheek, and for the first time she looked less like a witness collecting evidence, and more like someone hearing herself clearly for the first time and not liking the sound. Marcus let the silence remain a little longer. He had learned years ago that some truths did not need to be spoken immediately. Sometimes it was enough to let people stand inside them. The sun climbed another inch. Heat began to rise from the driveway in faint waves. The black surface of the SUV reflected a broken image of the street, the officers, the sky, and Ethan's pale figure standing awkwardly at the edge of it all. Marcus looked at that reflection and thought how quickly people could mistake what they saw for what was real. He thought of every young officer who would be watching him in the weeks to come, every resident who would study his choices before deciding whether to trust him, every room he would enter carrying both a badge and a burden that men like Ethan never had to carry at all. He felt no desire to punish this moment with cruelty. What he wanted was harder than cruelty. He wanted it to matter. He wanted the lesson to reach beyond embarrassment and settle somewhere permanent. Dana Ruiz seemed to sense that he was not finished thinking, so she said nothing. Neither did the younger officer. They simply stood with him in the stillness, giving him that space. Ethan swallowed again. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its edges. "I may have made an assumption," he said. The sentence floated there, weak and insufficient, not even close to the size of what had happened. Marcus looked at him, then at the silent houses, then back at the man who had tried to define him before breakfast. And in that clear, hard morning light, with the whole street listening through its windows whether it admitted it or not, Marcus understood that what happened next would tell them far more about power than the badge waiting for him ever could. Marcus let Ethan's words rest in the air without rescuing them. "I may have made an assumption." It was a sentence so small it almost disappeared against the size of the morning. Around them, Fairmont Ridge kept pretending to be peaceful. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the entrance of the subdivision. A pair of birds landed on a mailbox post and took off again. Somewhere down the block, a garage door hummed shut with the careful finality of someone deciding they no longer wanted to witness what they had helped create. Marcus stood in the center of it all and felt the strange weight of revelation settle over the street. It was not the satisfaction Ethan probably expected him to show. It was heavier than that. Sadder too, because in one sense, nothing surprising had happened at all. A black man arrived in a wealthy white neighborhood with a house, a luxury vehicle, and the quiet self-possession of someone who belonged there. And before he had unpacked his kitchen, suspicion came looking for him like it had been waiting at the curb. The surprise was only for the people who had not expected the story to turn. Marcus looked at Ethan for a long moment, then at Claire, whose eyes no longer rose easily to meet his. He saw something new there now. Not innocence. Not yet remorse exactly. But fracture. The first break in the smooth certainty that had carried her out onto the driveway with a phone in her hand and judgment already written across her face. Officer Dana Ruiz remained respectfully still. Her partner had taken a half step back, as if instinct told him this no longer belonged to the mechanics of a call, but to something more human and harder to file away. Marcus drew a measured breath and finally spoke. "An assumption is when you guess the weather wrong," he said, his voice even and low. What happened here was a decision. Nobody moved. The words were not loud, but they traveled. They crossed the driveway, the lawns, the open windows. They reached the neighbors who were no longer visible, but were still listening from behind curtains and cracked doors. Ethan's face changed, not dramatically, just enough to show that the sentence had found its mark. Marcus continued, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that gives people nowhere to hide from themselves. "You did not ask if I lived here. You did not ask if the vehicle was mine. You looked at me, and you decided I could not possibly belong to either one." Claire closed her eyes for half a second. The younger officer looked down. Dana Ruiz remained steady, though something in her jaw tightened with quiet understanding. Ethan tried to answer, but whatever he meant to say broke apart before it reached his mouth. Marcus had seen this before too, the moment when a person realized they had been counting on chaos and did not know what to do with truth delivered calmly. The heat was rising now from the pavement in soft waves. Light flashed off the SUV window and touched the bronze numbers beside Marcus's front door, making the address shine for one bright second like an underline. His address. His driveway. His house. The facts had been there from the beginning. Simple and visible. But facts often lose to fear when fear is protected by comfort. Marcus turned his eyes briefly toward the officers. "My first morning here," he said. "And this is what your future chief gets before his coffee." Dana let out the faintest breath, not quite a laugh, not quite an apology. "I am sorry, sir," she said. "You deserved better." Marcus nodded once. He appreciated that she said deserved, not expected. Because expectation was part of the problem. Too many people had learned to expect less dignity for some than for others. Ethan seemed to shrink another inch. "Chief," he repeated softly, as if saying the title out loud might somehow reorganize the world into something he recognized. Marcus looked back at him. "Yes," he said. "Chief." The word landed clean and final. No threat in it. No swagger. Just truth. Claire's hand tightened around the edge of her robe pocket where she had hidden the phone. Marcus wondered whether that video still existed on the screen. He wondered what it had captured before shame told her to lower it. The opening accusation. The crowd forming. The confidence. The contempt. He wondered if she would delete it or keep it and replay it later in private when the house was dark and Ethan was silent and the only voice left in the room was her own memory. Across the street, the front door of the house with the tennis skirt woman opened slightly, then closed again. Marcus noticed. Ethan noticed too. The street was listening. The whole neighborhood was listening. That was when Marcus understood the real twist in the morning. It was not simply that Ethan had accused the wrong man. It was that the man he accused was about to become the one responsible for serving every house on this street equally, including his. Marcus let that truth breathe for a second before he said, "You are lucky this was only humiliating. For a lot of people, moments like this become something else." The sentence settled deeper than the others. It widened the scene beyond this driveway, beyond Fairmont Ridge, beyond Ethan's embarrassment. Dana Ruiz lowered her gaze for a second in recognition. Ethan's mouth parted, but no defense came. Because there was none. Only a truth too large to step around. Marcus stood there in the bright, clean light of the neighborhood, calm and upright, and Ethan Whitmore finally saw not the man he had imagined, but the man who had been standing in front of him all along, and the realization hit him with a force that needed no raised voice at all. Ethan looked as though the title itself had knocked something loose inside him. Chief. The word had stripped the morning down to what it really was, and now there was no polished way to step around it. Claire kept her eyes lowered, one hand pressed against the pocket where she had hidden the phone, the other hanging stiffly at her side. The officers remained where they were, quiet and watchful, not intruding on the moment, but not abandoning it either. Marcus could feel the whole neighborhood listening from behind glass and half-closed doors, waiting to see what a man does when he finally has every reason to humiliate the people who tried to humiliate him first. He knew that kind of watching well. It followed men like him into courtrooms, council meetings, traffic stops, press briefings, and schools. People liked to call it curiosity. Often it was something else. A test. A search for proof that dignity under pressure was only temporary, that eventually he would become whatever fear had been hoping for from the start. Marcus was not interested in giving that fear anything to eat. Ethan drew a breath that sounded fragile in the warm air. "Chief Ellison," he said, trying again, the full name now heavy with a respect that had arrived too late to be mistaken for character. "I owe you an apology." Marcus said nothing. Ethan looked down at the driveway between them, at the clean concrete line where his lawn ended and Marcus's property began, as if he were only now understanding that he had crossed more than one boundary that morning. "I should have asked questions first," he continued. "I should not have assumed anything. I was trying to protect the neighborhood, but that is not an excuse." The words were better than the ones before, but Marcus had spent too many years hearing apologies built from caution rather than conviction. He could tell the difference. A real apology did not begin with self-protection. It began with truth. Claire finally spoke, and her voice was smaller than Marcus would have expected from the woman who had raised her phone so quickly. "I should not have recorded you," she said. "I saw everyone reacting, and I joined in. I am sorry." This time Marcus looked directly at her. There was no cruelty in his face, no satisfaction, only a tired kind of steadiness. You did more than join in, he said. You helped make a stranger into a threat before anyone had facts. Claire nodded once, and that was the first moment she seemed truly shaken. Not because she had been corrected in public, because she had been seen clearly. The breeze moved again through the trees, soft and almost cool for a second before the heat settled back over the pavement. Dana Ruiz glanced toward Marcus's open front door, then at the coffee cup visible on the kitchen counter through the entryway. The ordinary domestic detail made the whole thing feel even more exposed. A man had been standing at his own home, beginning his own morning, and an entire neighborhood had treated him like an intrusion. Marcus let the silence stretch just long enough for that truth to root itself. Then he spoke in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning, the tone that forced people to hear the content of his words because there was no anger to distract them. The dangerous part is not that you were wrong about the vehicle, he said. The dangerous part is how quickly you were certain you were right about me. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. Claire looked away. Even the younger officer shifted his weight, as if the sentence had reached beyond the couple and touched something broader in him too. Marcus went on, not to punish, but to make the moment useful. A neighborhood is not protected by suspicion alone. It is protected by judgment, fairness, and restraint. If you cannot tell the difference, then you are not keeping people safe. You are choosing who gets to feel safe and who has to earn it. The words moved through the stillness with quiet force. Across the street, a curtain twitched and stopped. Somewhere farther down the block, a lawnmower started, then cut off again almost immediately, as if even that sound felt too loud for the truth settling over the morning. Ethan swallowed hard. You are right, he said, and this time there was less polish in it, less performance. You are right. Marcus studied him for a moment. He believed Ethan was embarrassed. He was not yet sure Ethan was changed, but change rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it entered through humiliation, through silence, through the unbearable memory of hearing your own voice from the outside and realizing what it revealed. Marcus had no interest in revenge. Revenge would have been easy. It would also have taught the neighborhood the wrong lesson. He looked at Ethan, then at Claire, then at the houses behind them all. I am going to serve this city fairly, he said. That includes people who make mistakes about me. Ethan's face tightened, not in offense, but in the first real sign that mercy had cut deeper than anger would have. Claire pressed her lips together and lowered her head. Dana Ruiz exhaled quietly. Marcus gave a single nod, more closure than comfort, then turned toward the open door of his house. Behind him, nobody called out. Nobody tried to stop him. The street remained still, washed in hard morning light, while the couple he left standing in his driveway understood that the man they had tried to reduce had answered them with the one thing they had not earned and did not know how to hold. Marcus stepped into the house without hurry, and the cooler air inside touched his skin like a quiet hand on a fevered brow. Behind him, the neighborhood remained suspended in that strange after-silence that follows a truth nobody wanted but everybody needed. He did not close the door right away. He set the key fob on the narrow entry table beside an unopened box labeled office files, then glanced toward the kitchen where the coffee mug still waited near the edge of the counter, a thin ribbon of steam no longer rising from it. The house smelled like cardboard, fresh paint, and roasted coffee, the scent of beginnings interrupted but not ruined. Marcus walked across the hardwood floor, each step soft and measured, and lifted the mug into his hands. It had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Through the open doorway he could still see a slice of the driveway, the bright shoulder of the SUV, the edge of one patrol car, and beyond that the blur of Ethan Whitmore standing exactly where Marcus had left him. There was no triumph in the sight. Only a sober recognition that this was how some mornings in America still began for men like him. No matter the title, no matter the address, no matter the keys in their own palm. The difference now was that the lesson had not ended in a shout or an arrest or some uglier headline. It had ended in exposure. Sometimes exposure was its own kind of justice. Marcus set the mug down and rested both hands on the counter for a moment, head slightly bowed, breathing in through his nose, out through his mouth, letting the quiet settle where adrenaline had lived a few minutes before. He thought about the department waiting for him downtown, about the conference room with its neat binders and city seal on the wall, about the first row of officers who would study him before they listened to him, about the reporters who would ask polished questions and hide rough assumptions beneath them. He thought about the neighborhoods that would call him only when something had already gone wrong, and the neighborhoods that would never imagine they needed him until the day they did. And he thought about this street, this immaculate little pocket of comfort with its clipped hedges and stone facades, where the first thing some people had done upon seeing him was not welcome him, not question themselves, but summon authority as if authority could only arrive for them. Never as him. The front door remained open, framing the morning like a photograph. Dana Ruiz said something quietly outside, likely dismissing the call with more grace than it deserved. A patrol car door shut. Then another. Tires rolled softly over pavement. Marcus did not go back to the doorway to watch them leave. He did not need to. He could hear the scene dissolving by sound alone. The machinery of official response retreating. The private weight of memory staying behind. After a moment, he turned and walked back to the foyer. The box near the wall had split slightly at one corner, and a framed photograph showed through the opening. He knelt, lifted it carefully, and brushed away a few flecks of cardboard dust with his thumb. It was an older picture, one taken years before, his mother seated in a church dress with a small proud smile, his father standing beside her in a suit that had never fit quite perfectly, both of them looking into the camera with the kind of seriousness people wear when life has taught them not to waste dignity on performance. Marcus held the frame a second longer than he meant to. He could almost hear his mother's voice, calm and steady, telling him the same thing she had told him since he was young enough to need help tying a tie. Do not let somebody else's ignorance recruit your spirit. He set the photograph on the entry table beside his keys. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees again, carrying the dry whisper of leaves and the faint metallic click of a sprinkler head changing direction. The sounds were ordinary. The morning was ordinary. That was what made everything feel so sharp. He reached for the front door at last and paused before closing it. Ethan was still there across the driveway, no longer speaking, no longer performing, simply standing in the hard white light as if he had been left behind by his own certainty. Claire had gone inside. The neighbors were gone from porches and windows, but Marcus knew they would remember this, not just because of who he was, but because of how he had answered. Some lessons announce themselves with punishment. Others arrive as silence and stay longer. Marcus met Ethan's eyes from across the bright stretch of concrete. He did not nod. He did not frown. He simply looked at him with the calm, unshaken expression of a man who knew exactly who he was before anybody else tried to define him. Then he closed the door gently, and the latch clicked into place with a sound so small it almost disappeared. Inside the house, the quiet deepened. Sunlight fell across the floor in long, clean bands. Somewhere in another room, an unpacked clock began ticking again after having been still all night, each second landing softly in the new home of a man who had already been tested before breakfast and had chosen, again, not the easy power of humiliation, but the harder power of self-command. Marcus picked up his coffee, now fully cool, and walked farther into the house while outside the neighborhood sat with what it had revealed about itself. No one shouted. No one ran after him. No one tried to rewrite the morning. There was only the trimmed grass, the retreating heat, the hush behind closed doors, and one man standing alone on his own driveway at the end of a beautiful street, finally small enough to hear the sound of his own silence. Journal UKWMS.